I stood in the doorway of my own living room watching my son fold my clothes like I was already gone. Daniel didn't look at me. Vanessa didn't even pretend to care. "Mom, this is for the best," he said, zipping up my suitcase like he was sealing something final. 40 years of my life packed into 2 bags. I should have screamed. I should have begged, but I didn't. Because as I glanced toward the old dresser, I realized something neither of them had noticed. They forgot the small blue box. And that mistake was about to cost them everything. If you've ever trusted someone who turned their back on you, go ahead and like this video. And if you believe some lessons come too late, subscribe and stay with me, because what happened next changed everything. There was a time when the sound of Daniel's footsteps in that house meant something entirely different. Back then, they were lighter, faster, full of life. I used to recognize his mood just by how he came through the front door, whether he dropped his backpack with a sigh or ran straight into the kitchen asking what was for dinner. Those were the years when I still believed that no matter how hard life got, love inside a home could anchor everything. I'm Christina Russell. I'm 68 years old, and for most of my life, I was defined by one role, Daniel's mother. I didn't always plan for it to be that way. When my husband Thomas was still alive, we had dreams that stretched far beyond the walls of that house. He was a quiet man, steady and kind, the kind of person who made you feel safe without saying much. He worked long hours as a mechanic, and I worked as a junior accountant at a small firm in Atlanta. We weren't rich, but we were building something solid, brick by brick, paycheck by paycheck. Then one winter morning, everything collapsed. Thomas left for work before sunrise. By noon, I was standing in a hospital hallway gripping a paper cup of coffee that had gone cold, listening to a doctor explain words that didn't make sense together. Massive heart failure. We did everything we could. I'm sorry. Daniel was 10 years old. At that age, a child doesn't fully understand death, but they understand absence. They understand silence at the dinner table. They understand the way a house feels different when one voice is missing. And I understood something else. From that day forward, there was no backup plan. It was just me. I picked up every extra shift I could find. During the day, I worked at the accounting firm, eventually earning my way up to senior accountant through sheer persistence. At night, I did freelance bookkeeping for small businesses sometimes, until my eyes burned from staring at spreadsheets. On weekends, I cleaned offices downtown. I told myself it was temporary just until things got easier. They never really did. But Daniel grew, and that made everything worth it. And he was a good kid, polite, smart, determined, the kind of boy teachers praised during parent conferences, the kind neighbors smiled at. He never complained about the long hours I worked. Sometimes I'd find him asleep on the couch, textbooks still open on his chest, waiting for me to come home. I missed more moments than I like to admit. School plays basketball games, little things that matter more in hindsight, but I never missed the big ones. I was there when he graduated high school. I was there when he walked across that college stage, the first in our family to earn a degree. I remember sitting in the audience, my hands trembling as I clapped, tears blurring everything in front of me. "That's my son," I whispered to myself. Not just pride, relief. Because every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every dollar stretched to its limit, it all led to that moment. After college, Daniel landed a job at a mid-sized financial consulting firm in Atlanta. It wasn't glamorous at first, but it was stable, and stability to me meant everything. That was when things began to shift, though I didn't recognize it at the time. The house we lived in, it wasn't just a place, it was proof that I had survived. After Thomas passed, I saved relentlessly. Every bonus, every extra dollar went into that dream. It took me nearly 15 years, but eventually I bought that house outright. A modest but beautiful 2-story home in a quiet suburb outside the city. White siding, a small porch, a backyard big enough for summer barbecues we never quite had time for. I still remember the day I signed the final papers. The pen felt heavier than it should have. "This is yours," the agent said, smiling. "Ours," I thought. Everything I did with Daniel in mind. I imagined him bringing his future family there. Imagined grandchildren running through the hallways. Imagined a life that finally slowed down enough for us to enjoy it together. For a while, it felt like that future was coming true. Daniel got promoted, then promoted again. He started dressing differently. Tailored suits, polished shoes, the kind of confidence that comes from being noticed in the right rooms. He talked about clients' investments opportunities I didn't fully understand, but listened to anyway because I loved hearing him speak with that kind of certainty. And then one evening, he brought her home. Mom, he said, his voice carrying a strange mix of excitement and hesitation. This is Vanessa Russell. She stood in the doorway like she belonged there already, tall, elegant. Every detail about her looked intentional, from the way her hair fell perfectly over her shoulders, the way she smiled just enough to seem warm without revealing too much. She worked in real estate, Daniel explained. Smart, ambitious, successful in her own right. I've heard so much about you, Mrs. Russell, she said, extending her hand. Her grip was firm, controlled. Please, I replied. Forcing a smile, call me Christina. At first everything seemed fine. Better than fine, even. Vanessa was polite. She brought wine when she visited, complimented the house, asked about my work. She laughed at Daniel's stories, leaned into him in a way that made me believe she genuinely cared. I wanted to like her. I told myself I did. When Daniel announced they were getting married, I hugged him tight, whispering, "You deserve to be happy." And I meant it. The wedding was beautiful. Expensive, too. Far more than I would have ever imagined spending on a single day. Vanessa's family had a different kind of wealth. Not just financial, but social. Connections, expectations. I remember standing off to the side during the reception, watching Daniel in his suit, laughing with people I didn't know, moving through conversations that felt just out of my reach. Vanessa fit into that world effortlessly. Daniel was learning to. After the wedding, they moved into the house with me. It made sense at the time. They said it would be temporary just until they figured out their next step, maybe bought something closer to the city. I didn't mind. In fact, I was glad. The house felt alive again. For a few months, it almost felt like the family I had imagined years ago was finally real. But small things began to change. At first, it was subtle. Vanessa would rearrange things in the kitchen without asking. Move dishes, replace utensils, reorganize cabinets in a way that made sense to her, but left me searching for things in my own home. Just trying to make it more efficient, she'd say with a light laugh. Then came the comments. "You've done such a great job maintaining this place," she said one afternoon, running her hand along the kitchen counter. "But don't you think it might be time for something more modern?" I smiled politely. "This house has everything we need." She tilted her head slightly. "Of course. But sometimes what we need changes." Daniel didn't say anything. That silence. I noticed. Then there were the conversations that stopped when I entered the room. The late-night discussions behind closed doors. The way Daniel started checking his phone during dinner, distracted, distant. One evening, I tried to reach him. "Danny," I said softly, using the name I'd called him since he was a boy, "is everything okay?" He looked up, almost startled. "Yeah, Mom. Why wouldn't it be? You just seem busy." Distant. He exhaled, glancing briefly toward the hallway where Vanessa was. "It's just work. A lot going on." I nodded. But I knew my son. This wasn't just work. Something was shifting beneath the surface. Something I couldn't yet see clearly, but could feel in every quiet moment, every avoided conversation, every glance that didn't quite meet mine. I told myself not to overthink it. Families go through changes. That's normal. But deep down, there was a small, persistent voice I couldn't ignore, a warning, because the house I had spent my entire life building was starting to feel like it no longer belonged to me, and I didn't yet understand just how far that feeling would go. The first time I realized I was no longer being included, it wasn't during an argument. It was during silence. A quiet, ordinary Tuesday evening. I had just finished making dinner, roasted chicken, green beans, and mashed potatoes. Daniel used to love that meal when he was younger. He used to hover in the kitchen, stealing bites before everything was even on the table. That night, he didn't come downstairs until Vanessa called him. "Dinner's ready," I said, setting the plates down, trying to keep my voice warm. Daniel sat across from me. Vanessa sat beside him, the three of us at the same table. But it didn't feel like a family anymore. They spoke to each other more than they spoke to me. Short exchanges, half-finished sentences, inside conversations I wasn't part of. "Did you get the email?" Vanessa asked casually. Daniel nodded. "Yeah, I'll review it tonight." "Good," she said, glancing at him in a way that felt more like a business partner than a wife. I picked at my food, listening without trying to listen. "What email?" I asked, lightly, hoping to join in. Vanessa smiled, polite but distant. "Oh, just something related to a property deal." I nodded, even though that answer didn't really explain anything. Daniel didn't elaborate. He didn't even look at me. That was the moment I felt it clear and undeniable. I was no longer part of the conversation. At first, I told myself it was nothing. They were newly married, building their own life. Of course, they would have things to discuss that didn't involve me, but it didn't stop there. Over the next few weeks, the house began to change in ways that were small on the surface, but heavy underneath. Vanessa started making decisions without asking. One afternoon, I came home from running errands and found the living room completely rearranged. The couch had been moved, the rug replaced, new decorative pieces placed on the shelves like they had always been there. "Oh, Christina, you're back," Vanessa said cheerfully. "I hope you don't mind. I just thought the space could feel a little more open." I stood in the doorway, taking it all in. "It looks different," I said carefully. "Better right," she replied with a confident smile. Daniel walked in behind her, glancing around. "Yeah, it actually does." I forced a small smile. "Of course," I said. But inside, something tightened. It wasn't about the furniture, it was about the fact that no one had thought to ask me. Little by little, that pattern repeated. Vanessa changed the brand of groceries we bought, switched out the laundry detergent, even replaced the framed photos in the hallway with newer ones, pictures from her and Daniel's wedding, their vacations, their life together. The older photos, the ones of Daniel as a child of Thomas and me, were moved to a box in the closet. I found them there one evening, stacked neatly, out of sight. I stood there for a long time, holding a picture of Daniel at 8 years old, his front teeth missing his smile, wide and fearless. "Mom, look," he had said that day, holding up a report card full of A's. I remembered how proud he had been, how proud I had been, and now, that memory was tucked away like it no longer belonged on the walls. Vanessa thought it would be nice to update things, Daniel said from behind me. I hadn't even heard him walk in. "They're just pictures," he added. I turned slowly, still holding the frame. "They're not just pictures," I said quietly. He sighed like I was making something simple more complicated than it needed to be. "Mom, it's not a big deal." "Not a big deal." I nodded, placing the photo back into the box. "You're right," I said softly. But I knew he was wrong. It was a big deal because it wasn't about the photos. It was about being erased. After that, I started noticing the way Vanessa spoke about the house. Not your home, not even our home, just the house. "This house has good bones," she said one afternoon while scrolling through something on her tablet, "but it's definitely outdated." I was sitting at the kitchen table balancing my checkbook, a habit I had never abandoned even after retiring. "It served us well," I replied. She glanced up, her expression thoughtful. "Of course. But don't you ever think about what it could be? If it were upgraded," Daniel looked between us, then back at his phone. "I think it's fine," he said quickly, almost automatically. But Vanessa didn't let it go. "Fine isn't the same as optimal," she said, her tone calm but firm. "There's a lot of untapped value here." That word again, value, not memories, not history, value. She began bringing it up more often after that, casually at first, then more directly. "Properties in this area are selling for a lot right now," she mentioned over breakfast one morning. "It's actually a really good time to consider listing." I looked at her, then at Daniel. "Listing," I repeated. Daniel shifted slightly in his seat. "She just means exploring options." "What kind of options?" I asked. Vanessa set her coffee down her eyes, meeting mine with a kind of practiced calm. "Christina, you've built a wonderful life here," she said smoothly. "But this house is much larger than what you really need. And financially, it might make more sense to sell and move into something smaller, more manageable." I felt the words land slowly, like stones dropping into water. "You want me to sell my house?" I said. Daniel leaned forward slightly. "Mom, it's not like that. We're just thinking about what's best for everyone. Everyone." I let that word sit in the air. "And what happens after that?" I asked quietly. Vanessa smiled faintly. "We reinvest. Maybe purchase something more modern, closer to the city. It would be a smart move, a smart move." I looked at Daniel again. He didn't meet my eyes. That was when the unease I'd been feeling finally settled into something clearer, something sharper. This wasn't just a suggestion. This was a plan, and I wasn't part of making it. "Let me think about it," I said, keeping my voice steady. Vanessa nodded as if she had expected nothing less. "Of course," she said. Daniel exhaled, almost relieved that there wasn't an argument, but I wasn't relieved, because for the first time I realized something that changed everything. They weren't asking me, they were preparing me to let go of the one thing I had built with my entire life. And the worst part, Daniel, my son, was standing right beside her, not as my ally, but as someone who was slowly, quietly slipping out of my reach. That night, I lay awake in my bed staring at the ceiling. The house was quiet, too quiet, and in that silence, a single thought kept repeating in my mind. If I didn't start paying closer attention, I might lose more than just a house. The first time Vanessa said it outright, she didn't even try to soften it. We were sitting in the kitchen on a Saturday morning. Sunlight spilled across the countertops, catching dust in the air like tiny suspended moments. Daniel was scrolling through his phone, half listening as usual, while Vanessa stood near the island with her tablet open, tapping and swiping with focused precision. "I spoke with a colleague yesterday," she said, not looking up. "He just closed on a property 2 streets over, smaller than this house, worse condition, and it sold for $620,000. My hand paused midair, the coffee cup hovering just below my lips. "That's a good price," I said carefully. "It's more than good," she replied, finally lifting her eyes to meet mine. "It's an opportunity." Daniel glanced up, then interest flickering across his face. $620. Vanessa nodded, and that was without any major upgrades. This house, with the right staging, the right positioning, we could easily match that, possibly more. There it was again. We. I set my cup down slowly. "This house isn't on the market," I said. Vanessa smiled, not dismissively, but with a patience that felt rehearsed. "Not yet." Daniel leaned forward, elbows on the table. "Mom, just hear her out." I looked at him. Really looked this time. The way his posture had shifted, the way his tone had changed. He wasn't just considering the idea, he had already stepped into it. "What exactly am I hearing?" I asked quietly. Vanessa moved closer, her voice calm, controlled, persuasive. "You're sitting on a high-value asset," she said, "one that's not being utilized efficiently. You don't need this much space. Maintenance alone is unnecessary stress at your age. If you sell now, you can downsize, free up capital, and actually enjoy your life without the burden." The words were logical, clean, sharp, and completely devoid of anything that mattered to me. "This house isn't a burden," I said. Daniel sighed softly, like he had been expecting resistance. "Mom, no one's saying it is. But things change. You've always taught me to think ahead, to make smart decisions." I felt something twist in my chest. "I taught you to value what you have," I replied. "And I am," he said quickly. "That's exactly what this is. Recognizing value, that word again." I pushed my chair back slightly, needing space. "And what happens after I sell?" I asked. Vanessa didn't hesitate. "We reinvest," she said. "We can manage the funds, find a better property. Something modern, efficient. You'd still be comfortable, even more so. You'd still be comfortable, not you'll still be at home. Not you'll still feel safe. Comfortable, like I was being relocated, not respected. And who manages the money? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Daniel spoke this time. "We do," he said. "I mean, it makes sense, right? I work in finance. Vanessa knows the real estate market. We can handle everything, I let the silence stretch between us. In that moment, something became very clear. They weren't just suggesting I sell the house. They were planning what came after. Without me. "I need time," I said finally. Vanessa nodded again, smooth and composed. "Of course, but the market doesn't wait forever." Daniel added, "We're just trying to help Mom." "Help." I stood up from the table, my appetite gone. I said I need time. I repeated more firmly this time, and I walked out before either of them could respond. That afternoon, I sat alone in the living room, the same room where I had once watched Daniel take his first steps, where Thomas had fallen asleep in his armchair after long days of work, where holidays had filled the air with laughter that now felt like it belonged to someone else. I looked around, taking in every detail. The walls, the windows, the faint creak of the floorboards I knew by heart. This house wasn't just a structure, it was a timeline. And now someone was trying to turn it into a transaction. I closed my eyes, letting the weight of it settle. They think I'm weak, I realized. They think I'm old, sentimental, easy to convince. A part of me wanted to confront them, to demand respect, to remind Daniel of everything this house represented. But another part of me, quieter, sharper, told me something else. Wait, watch, understand. That evening, I made dinner again, habit more than hunger. They came downstairs together, talking softly, stopping mid-sentence when they saw me. "Smells good," Daniel said, forcing a smile. Vanessa nodded politely. We sat, we ate. And for the first time in years, I chose not to fill the silence. I let it exist. I let them feel it. Halfway through the meal, Vanessa spoke again. "I've already started looking into potential listings," she said casually, "just to get a sense of the market." I didn't react immediately, just took another bite, chewed, slowly swallowed. "You move quickly," I said. She smiled faintly. "In this business, you have to." Daniel added, "It's just research, Mom. No decisions yet, no decisions yet." But the direction was already set. I placed my fork down gently. If I decide to sell, I said, choosing each word carefully, it will be because I choose to, not because I'm pressured. Vanessa's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes shifted just slightly. "Of course," she said. Daniel nodded. "Absolutely." But I knew better. Pressure doesn't always come as force. Sometimes it comes as persistence, as inevitability, as the slow erosion of resistance, and that was exactly what they were doing. Later that night, I sat at my desk in my bedroom, the one place in the house that still felt entirely mine. I opened an old folder I hadn't looked at in years. Inside were documents, original purchase papers, mortgage records, legal notes, things I had kept not out of suspicion, but out of habit. I had spent my entire career working with numbers, with contracts, with the fine print most people overlooked. It wasn't in my nature to be careless. And as I flipped through those pages, a thought began to form. Slowly, carefully. They think I don't understand what they're doing. They think I'll sign whatever they put in front of me. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. Maybe I should let them think that. Maybe the best way to protect what's mine is to let them believe they've already won. A strange calm settled over me, not the kind that comes from acceptance, but the kind that comes from decision. The next morning, I joined them in the kitchen. Vanessa was already there, coffee in hand, tablet open. Daniel looked up as I walked in. "I've thought about it," I said. They both went still. And then I gave them exactly what they were waiting for. "All right," I said quietly. "I'll sell the house." Daniel exhaled in relief, a small smile breaking through. Vanessa's lips curved into something more controlled, more satisfied. "I think that's a very wise decision," she said. I nodded. "Yes," I replied, "it is." But what neither of them saw was the thought I kept to myself. Because sometimes the smartest move you can make is the one your opponent believes benefits them the most. The moment I said yes, everything began moving faster than it ever had before. Too fast. It was as if Daniel and Vanessa had been waiting behind an invisible starting line, already prepared, already organized, just needing my permission to run. By the next morning, Vanessa had a list of real estate agents. By the afternoon, she had narrowed it down to one. "He's the best in the area," she said, sliding her tablet across the kitchen counter toward me. "Top sales, strong network, quick turnaround." I glanced at the screen. A smiling man in a tailored suit stared back at me, his credentials laid out like a carefully constructed resume of success. "How did you find him so quickly?" I asked. Vanessa didn't miss a beat. "I told you this is my field." "Of course." Daniel nodded. "If Vanessa trusts him, I do too." I didn't respond right away. Instead, I picked up my coffee and took a slow sip, letting the silence stretch just enough to remind myself who I was. Then I nodded. "All right," I said. "Set up a meeting." Vanessa smiled just a little too quickly. The agent came 2 days later. His name was Gregory Lane, and he carried himself with the kind of confidence that comes from closing deals, not building relationships. "Mrs. Russell," he said warmly as he stepped inside, extending his hand. "You have a beautiful property here." "Thank you," I replied. He walked through the house with Vanessa leading the way, pointing out features, discussing potential improvements, suggesting minor staging adjustments. "Natural light is excellent," Gregory said, pausing in the living room. "With the right presentation, we can definitely push toward the higher end of the market." "Exactly what I was thinking," Vanessa replied. Daniel followed them, listening, nodding, absorbing. I stayed a step behind, watching, listening, learning. When we sat down at the kitchen table, Gregory laid out the process. Given current market conditions, he began, "We can list within a week. Photography minor, staging open house within days. If priced correctly, this could move very quickly." "How quickly?" Daniel asked. 2 to 3 weeks, potentially less," Gregory said. "We've seen similar properties receive multiple offers within days." Vanessa leaned forward slightly. "And closing 30 days standard," Gregory replied. "Sometimes sooner if the buyer is motivated." Everything about his answers was efficient, clean, transactional. I folded my hands together on the table. "And the paperwork?" I asked. "Straightforward," he said. "I'll prepare everything. You'll just need to review and sign." "Review and sign?" I nodded slowly. "I'd like time to read everything carefully," I said. There was a brief pause. Not long, but enough. "Of course," Gregory said, though his tone suggested it wasn't what he preferred. "We'll make sure you're comfortable." Vanessa smiled at me. Christina's always been very detail-oriented. I met her gaze. "Yes," I said, "I have. The house changed quickly after that. Vanessa arranged for new furniture to be brought in temporary pieces she explained for staging. Neutral colors, minimalist design, clean lines. This helps buyers envision themselves here," she said. I watched as my home slowly transformed into something unrecognizable. The couch I had chosen years ago gone. The curtains Thomas and I had picked together replaced. Even the small imperfections, the ones that made the house feel lived in, were erased. "It looks like a model home now," Daniel said one evening, looking around with approval. I stood beside him, my arms folded loosely. "It doesn't look like home," I replied. He didn't respond. Vanessa did. "That's the point," she said. The first time Gregory brought paperwork, it came in a neat folder. He placed it on the table in front of me, flipping it open with practiced ease. "This is the listing agreement," he explained. "Standard terms, commission structure, pricing, strategy, marketing plan." Vanessa leaned over, scanning quickly. "Everything looks fine," she said. Daniel nodded. "Yeah, seems straightforward." I didn't move. "Let me read it," I said. Vanessa hesitated just for a second. "Of course," she said again. I took the folder and carried it to my room, closed the door, sat down at my desk, and I read. Not quickly, not casually, but the way I had spent decades reading documents line by line, word by word, paying attention not just to what was there, but to what wasn't. Clauses, conditions, responsibilities. Transfers. There was nothing overtly wrong, nothing illegal, nothing that would raise immediate concern. But there were assumptions built into the structure, assumptions about control, about access, about who would manage the proceeds after the sale. I closed the folder slowly. They think I won't notice, I thought. They think I'll trust them. I smiled faintly. That night, I signed the listing agreement. The open house was scheduled for the following weekend. People came and went. Strangers walking through rooms filled with pieces of my life, except they couldn't see any of it. They saw square footage, lighting, potential. I watched from a distance as Vanessa spoke to visitors, her tone polished and confident. "This space is perfect for entertaining," she said, "and the neighborhood is highly desirable." Daniel stood beside her, smiling, reinforcing everything she said. At one point, a young couple stopped in front of me. "Are you the owner?" the woman asked. I hesitated. "Yes," I said. She smiled warmly. "It's a beautiful home. You must have a lot of memories here." I looked around. At the walls that no longer held our photos, at the furniture that wasn't mine, at the version of my life that had been staged for sale. "Yes," I said quietly, "I do." The offers came quickly, faster than even Gregory had predicted. Multiple offers, he announced, excitement clear in his voice. "We're in a strong position." Vanessa's eyes lit up. Daniel looked almost relieved. They reviewed the offers together, discussing numbers, terms, timelines. I sat at the table with them, listening, waiting. "This one is the best," Vanessa said, tapping the paper. $620,000, clean terms, fast closing. Daniel nodded. "We should take it." They both looked at me. The final step, the final approval. I took a breath. "And you're sure?" I asked. Vanessa didn't hesitate. "Absolutely." Daniel added, "It's the right move, Mom, the right move." I picked up the pen. The same kind of pen I had used years ago to sign the papers that made this house mine. Funny how something that builds can also be used to dismantle. I signed, slowly, deliberately. Gregory smiled, gathering the documents. "Congratulations," he said. "We'll move forward with the buyer." Vanessa leaned back, satisfied. Daniel exhaled, tension leaving his shoulders. And I simply placed the pen down. Because while they believed that signature meant the end of something, they didn't realize it was only the beginning. Because there was one thing they still didn't know, one detail they hadn't questioned, one small piece they had overlooked in their rush to move forward. And that piece was already waiting for its moment. The day the money came through, everything changed. Not slowly, not subtly, completely. It started with a notification on Daniel's phone. I heard the soft buzz from across the room. He was standing by the kitchen counter, scrolling absently when his expression shifted, just for a moment, but enough. "It's in," he said. Vanessa looked up immediately. Already Daniel nodded, his voice carrying something I hadn't heard in a long time. Excitement. 620,000, he added, almost under his breath, like he needed to hear it out loud to believe it. Vanessa stood walking over to him, her eyes fixed on the screen. "Let me see." They leaned in together, shoulders nearly touching, studying the numbers like they were looking at something sacred. I stayed where I was, at the edge of the room, watching. That number, it meant something very different to me. To them, it was opportunity. To me, it was the sum of decades. Years of work, years of sacrifice, years of choosing responsibility over comfort. And now it sat inside an account I didn't control. "Everything went smoothly," Daniel said, glancing over at me with a smile that felt distant. "No issues at all." "Good," I replied simply. Vanessa turned toward me, her expression composed, but there was a brightness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "This really opens up a lot of possibilities," she said. "We can start looking at new properties right away. I nodded. "Of course," I said. But something inside me had already shifted, because in that moment I realized something I hadn't fully allowed myself to see before. They weren't celebrating with me. They were celebrating without me. The new house wasn't something we chose together. It was something Vanessa presented. "This one is perfect," she said one evening, showing us pictures on her tablet. "Modern layout, great location close to the city. It's exactly what we need." Daniel looked impressed. "It's nice," he said, "really nice." I studied the images, clean lines, glass, steel. Everything about it felt cold. "How big is it?" I asked. "Smaller than the current house," Vanessa replied, "but more efficient." "More efficient? And where would I be?" I asked. There was a brief pause. Not long, but enough. "Well," Vanessa said, choosing her words carefully, "there's a guest room. I let that settle." Daniel shifted slightly beside her. "Mom, it's just temporary. Until we figure things out. Temporary." I nodded slowly. "I see." And I did. More clearly than ever, the move happened quickly. Too quickly for reflection, too quickly for hesitation. Boxes packed, furniture moved, papers signed. The house I had lived in for decades was no longer mine. And the new place never truly was. From the moment I stepped inside, I felt it. The difference, the absence. It wasn't just that the space was unfamiliar. It was that I didn't belong in it. Vanessa took charge immediately. "This will go here," she said, directing movers. "No, not that, this side." Daniel followed her lead, carrying boxes, adjusting placements, fitting into her vision seamlessly. I stood near the entrance holding a small bag, my things, the essentials. Everything else had been decided for me. "Your room is down the hall," Vanessa said, pointing without looking directly at me. I walked there slowly, opened the door. The room was clean, minimal, a bed, a dresser, a small window. Nothing personal, nothing that felt like mine. I set my bag down on the bed, sat beside it. And for the first time since all of this began, I felt it fully. Not just unease, not just suspicion, loss. Real, undeniable loss. The first few days passed in a blur. Vanessa settled in, quickly organizing, arranging, establishing control over every inch of the space. Daniel adapted just as fast. Their routines continued, their conversations flowed, their lives moved forward, and I became something else, an afterthought. It started with small things, meals I wasn't told about, conversations that stopped when I entered the room, plans made without including me. "Vanessa and I are heading out tonight," Daniel said one evening, grabbing his keys. "Oh," I replied. "Where to? Just dinner," he said. "Nothing special." Vanessa appeared behind him already dressed. "You don't have to wait up," she added. I nodded. Of course. The door closed behind them, and I stood there in a house that echoed in a way my old one never had. It didn't take long for Vanessa's tone to change. Subtly at first, then more openly. "This arrangement isn't really sustainable," she said one afternoon, standing in the kitchen while I washed a cup. I turned slightly. "What do you mean?" She crossed her arms, leaning against the counter. "I mean long term," she said. "This was always supposed to be temporary." I dried my hands slowly. "I was told the same thing," I replied. She nodded. "Yes, and we're at the point where we need to think about next steps. And those would be," I asked. She met my gaze directly. "You finding your own place." The words landed clean, sharp, final. I felt something inside me go very still. "This is my home now," she continued. "Daniel and I need our space, our privacy. I almost smiled at the familiarity of the word, and Daniel feels the same way, I asked quietly. Vanessa didn't hesitate. Yes. That evening, Daniel had the conversation. Not in anger, not in cruelty, but in something worse, detachment. "Mom," he said, sitting across from me at the small dining table, "we've been talking, and it's probably best if you start looking for your own place." I looked at him, really looked, searching for something, anything. The boy who used to run into my arms, the young man who once told me I was his greatest support. I didn't see him. I saw someone else, someone who had learned to justify what was convenient. "I gave you everything," I said softly. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. And I appreciate that he replied, "I really do. But things change. Things change." "Yes," I said, "they do." He leaned forward slightly. "We're not kicking you out," he added quickly. "We just think it's time. Time." I nodded slowly. "All right," I said. He blinked, surprised. "That's it?" he asked. "That's it," I replied. Because what was the point of arguing? What was the point of reminding him of things he had already chosen to forget? "Okay," he said, standing. "We'll help you pack. Help me pack." The words echoed in my mind. Not long ago, I had packed his school lunches, his bags for college, the small pieces of his life as he moved forward. And now, he was offering to pack me away. The next morning, Daniel brought out the suitcases, 2 of them, large, empty, waiting. "Let's get started," he said. I stood in the doorway of the room they had given me, looking around, at the space that had never truly been mine, at the life that had been reduced to a few contained pieces. And then slowly, I stepped forward. Because they believed this was the end of my place in their lives. They believed they had taken everything that mattered. They believed I was leaving with nothing. And I let them believe it, because sometimes the most powerful move you can make is to walk away without showing what you still hold. The sound of the suitcase zipper closing echoed louder than it should have. It was such a small, ordinary sound, but in that moment it felt final. Daniel stood at the foot of the bed, pressing down on the lid to force it shut. His movements were efficient, almost mechanical fold-place zip. No hesitation, no lingering. Vanessa leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, watching the process like someone overseeing a task being completed. Not a mother leaving her home, a situation being resolved. I stood by the dresser, my hands resting lightly against the wood, feeling the faint grooves beneath my fingers. It was one of the few pieces from the old house that had made it here, though it no longer held anything that truly mattered. "Do you want me to take those too?" Daniel asked, gesturing toward a small stack of clothes on the chair. I glanced at them. "No," I said. "That's fine." He nodded and moved on without question. That was the part that hurt the most. Not anger, not even betrayal, just absence. The absence of pause, of doubt, of emotion. He didn't look at me the way a son looks at his mother. He looked at me the way someone looks at a task they need to finish. "Mom," he said after a moment, his voice softer. "This doesn't have to be a bad thing." I almost smiled. "Doesn't have to be." I turned slightly, meeting his eyes. "It already is," I replied gently. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Vanessa shifted her weight in the doorway. "It's about moving forward," she said. "For everyone, forward, always forward, never looking back." I nodded as if I understood, as if I agreed, because there was no point in arguing anymore. They weren't listening, and I wasn't trying to convince them. They packed quickly. Faster than I would have, faster than I ever did when Daniel was younger, and I took my time folding his clothes, making sure everything was just right. Now things were placed without care, stacked, compressed, reduced. I watched as pieces of my life disappeared into those suitcases. A sweater I had worn on cold mornings, a book I had read more times than I could count. Small things, but they carried weight, memories, meaning. And with every item that vanished into those bags, I felt something inside me settle not in grief, but in clarity. This wasn't happening to me. This was being done, and I was letting it happen. On purpose. "Where are you planning to go?" Daniel asked as he zipped up the second suitcase. I walked over to the bed, placing my hand lightly on the handle. "I've made arrangements," I said. That wasn't entirely a lie. I had somewhere to stay. Temporary. Enough. He nodded, relieved. "Good," he said. "That's good." Vanessa didn't ask. She didn't need to. As far as she was concerned, the outcome was already decided. There was a moment just before I left the room when I turned back. Not because I was unsure, but because I needed to see it one last time. The space, the walls, the life that had been rearranged until I no longer fit inside it. And then I noticed something. The dresser, one drawer, slightly open, just enough to catch my attention. Daniel must have missed it. Or maybe he had opened it and decided it wasn't important. I walked over slowly, pulled the drawer open, and there it was. The small blue box, exactly where I had left it, unmoved, untouched, unnoticed. For a moment I simply stared at it, not because I was surprised, but because this right here was the moment everything shifted. All their planning, all their control, all their certainty, and they had missed the one thing that mattered most. I reached inside my fingers, brushing against the smooth surface. Cool, familiar, steady. I closed my hand around it and lifted it carefully. "Is there something else?" Daniel asked from behind me. I turned slightly, keeping the box partially hidden in my palm. "Just one last thing," I said. He nodded, not curious enough to ask more. Vanessa glanced over briefly, then looked away. They didn't see it. They didn't understand. And that was exactly why it mattered. I slipped the blue box into my bag, quietly, effortlessly, like it had always belonged there. We walked down the hallway together, the three of us. But it didn't feel like we were walking together. It felt like I was being escorted out. The front door stood open, sunlight pouring in bright and indifferent. My suitcases sat by the entrance, waiting, ready. Daniel picked one up. "I'll carry these out." "I can manage," I said. "It's fine," he replied. Of course it was. He carried them anyway. Vanessa stepped aside, giving me just enough space to pass without touching her. I paused at the doorway, not because I was hesitating, but because I was observing, taking it in. This was the moment they believed they had won, that everything had gone according to plan, that I was leaving with nothing but what they had allowed me to take. "Mom," Daniel said, his voice softer now, almost uncertain. "You'll be okay, right?" I looked at him, really looked, and for a brief second I saw something flicker in his eyes. Not regret, not yet, but something close, a question, a doubt, something he hadn't fully let himself feel. "I'll be more than okay," I said calmly. He nodded, though I wasn't sure he understood. Vanessa checked her watch. "We should get going," she said. "We have a meeting later." Of course they did. Life doesn't pause for endings, not when you're the one walking away. Daniel set the suitcases by the car, opened the trunk, placed them inside. I stood on the driveway, the small blue box resting quietly in my bag, its weight barely noticeable to anyone else. But to me, it was everything. Because inside that box was more than just paper, more than just records. It was truth, proof, control, the one thing they hadn't taken, the one thing they hadn't even thought to look for. "Do you need a ride?" Daniel asked. "No," I said. "I'll manage." He nodded again, always nodding, always accepting what was easiest. I stepped back, away from the car, away from the house, away from them. And as I did, I felt something unexpected. Not sadness, not anger, freedom, because the moment they believed they had stripped me of everything was the moment they gave me the space to act, to think, to decide, without interference, without pressure, without illusion. I turned and began to walk away, not looking back, not slowing down, because some endings don't need to be witnessed twice, and some mistakes take time before they reveal their cost. Behind me, I heard the car door close, heavily, final, but I didn't stop, because I knew something they didn't, something they would soon learn. The small blue box they forgot wasn't just something I had left behind. It was something I had been waiting to take with me. And when the time came, it wouldn't just change my life. It would change theirs. The first night alone is always the hardest, not because of the silence, but because of what the silence reveals. I sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the small apartment I had rented on short notice, a modest one-bedroom above a laundromat on the quieter side of town. It wasn't much. The walls were thin, the furniture worn, and the faint hum of machines downstairs seeped through the floor like a constant reminder of where I was, and where I was not. But for the first time in weeks, I could breathe. No footsteps above me, no hushed conversations behind closed doors, no careful balancing of words at the dinner table, just space, just stillness, and the small blue box resting in my lap. I hadn't opened it yet, not because I didn't know what was inside, but because I understood the weight of it, because once I did, there would be no turning back. I ran my fingers slowly over the lid, tracing the faint scratches along the edges, marks left by time, by years of being opened, closed, handled carefully, then hidden away again. This box had been with me longer than Daniel could remember, longer than Vanessa had even known him. It wasn't just something forgotten in a drawer. It was something deliberately kept out of sight, out of reach. I exhaled slowly, then I opened it. Inside, everything was exactly as I had left it, neatly arranged, precise, intentional. On top lay a thin stack of documents secured with a simple clip. Beneath them, a small digital recorder, and under that, a sealed envelope, its edges slightly yellowed with age. I picked up the documents first. Even before reading them, I felt that familiar sense of control returning piece by piece, because these weren't just papers, they were protection. The first page was the original deed to the house. My name, only mine, clear, undisputed. The next document was where things became interesting. A legal addendum. One I had added years ago quietly, carefully after a conversation with a lawyer who had seen too many families fall apart over property. Always protect your primary asset, he had told me, even from people you trust. At the time, I had almost laughed. Protect it from Daniel, my own son. The idea had felt unnecessary, almost insulting, but I had listened anyway, because I was practical, because I understood risk, because love doesn't cancel out possibility. The addendum was simple but powerful. Any sale or transfer of the property required not just a signature, but a secondary verification tied to the original documentation. Documentation that had never left my possession. Documentation that had never been included in the copies Vanessa reviewed. I read the clause again slowly, then again. Not because I didn't understand it, but because I needed to feel it settle. The sale they had rushed through, the transaction they celebrated, the money they now believed was theirs to control, wasn't as final as they thought, not without this. I set the documents down carefully and reached for the recorder. It was small, unremarkable, the kind of device no one pays attention to, which is exactly why it had worked. I turned it over in my hand, remembering the night I had used it. The kitchen. Late. Vanessa's voice. Daniel's hesitation. I pressed play. At first there was only static. Then, voices. "We can't wait too long," Vanessa was saying. Her tone was sharper than usual, stripped of the polite restraint she wore during the day. If she starts asking too many questions, this gets complicated. Daniel's voice came next, quieter. "She trusts me." A pause. Then Vanessa again. "Exactly. And we need to keep it that way." I felt my jaw tighten slightly. The recording continued. "The house is the key," Vanessa said. "Once it's sold, everything else falls into place." "And what about Mom?" Daniel asked. Another pause. This one longer. "We'll figure something out," Vanessa replied. "She doesn't need that much space anyway. We can transition her somewhere smaller. Transition. Like I was a problem to be managed, a variable to be adjusted. And the money, Daniel asked. Vanessa didn't hesitate. "We handle it," she said. "Invest it properly, grow it." She wouldn't know what to do with that kind of capital. I stopped the recording. Silence filled the room again, but it wasn't the same silence as before. This one had weight, direction, clarity. I placed the recorder back into the box, because I had heard enough, more than enough. Finally, I picked up the envelope. This one. I hadn't opened in years. Not because I had forgotten about it, but because I hadn't needed to. Until now. I slid my finger under the flap and opened it carefully. Inside was a single document, a notarized statement, one that tied everything together, proof of original ownership, proof of retained rights, proof that the transaction they believed was complete, could be challenged, legally, directly, effectively. I leaned back against the wall, the document resting lightly in my hands. For a long moment I just sat there, thinking. Not about revenge, not about anger, but about consequence. Because what they had done wasn't just a mistake, it was a choice, a series of choices. And now, those choices had weight, real weight, the kind that doesn't disappear just because you regret it later. I closed the box slowly, carefully, deliberately, and for the first time since I walked out of that house, I allowed myself to feel something I had been holding back. Not sadness, not even hurt, power, quiet, controlled, earned. Because everything they thought they had taken from me was still within my reach. Everything they believed they controlled was still tied to me. They had rushed. They had assumed. They had overlooked the one thing that mattered most. And now, I had time. Time to think. Time to plan. Time to decide how this would end. I stood up from the bed, the small blue box in my hands. The room around me was simple, unremarkable, temporary. But it didn't matter, because this wasn't where my story ended. This was where it turned. I placed the box gently on the small table by the window. Outside, the streetlights flickered on, one by one, casting a soft glow over the quiet street below. A new beginning. Not the kind I had imagined, but the kind I would control. And somewhere not far from here, Daniel and Vanessa were still living in the illusion they had created, still believing the deal was done, still believing I had walked away with nothing. I almost smiled, because illusions have a way of breaking. And when they do, the truth doesn't arrive quietly. It arrives all at once. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. Old habits. Years of early mornings of getting up before the world demanded anything from me had trained my body to move before my mind even caught up. For a moment, I lay there in the unfamiliar bed, staring at the faint cracks in the ceiling, listening to the distant rumble of the city waking up. Then I remembered where I was, and more importantly, why. The small blue box sat on the table by the window exactly where I had left it, waiting, not impatiently, but with quiet certainty. I sat up slowly, my joints reminding me of my age, but my mind sharper than it had been in years. There's something about betrayal, real betrayal, that strips away distraction. It clarifies things, forces you to see what you once chose to ignore. I walked over to the window and pulled the curtain aside. The street below was already alive in its own quiet way. A man unlocking his shop, a woman walking her dog, ordinary life continuing unaware of the storm that had just begun in mine. I rested my hand on the box. Today I told myself, you stop reacting. Today, you act. The flashback came to me clearly as I poured myself a cup of coffee in the tiny kitchen. It was years ago, long before Vanessa, long before Daniel learned to measure life in numbers instead of moments. I had been sitting in a small office across from a man named Harold Benton, an estate attorney I had been referred to by a colleague. At the time, I had gone in for something simple, basic estate planning, a will, a way to ensure that if something happened to me, Daniel would be taken care of without complications. Most people think planning is about death, Harold had said, adjusting his glasses as he reviewed my paperwork, but it's really about control, about making sure your intentions are respected even when you're not there to explain them. I remember smiling politely, not fully grasping the depth of what he meant. I trust my son, I had said. This is just a formality. Harold had looked at me for a long moment before nodding slowly. I'm sure you do, he replied, but trust and protection aren't opposites, Mrs. Russell. They're partners. At the time, it had felt unnecessary, almost excessive, but I listened anyway, because I had spent my life building things carefully. And careful people don't ignore good advice. We went over the documents together, line by line, clause by clause. That's the addendum he had said at one point, tapping the page gently. It ensures that any sale or transfer of your primary residence requires secondary verification tied to the original deed. I frowned slightly. Why is that necessary? He leaned back in his chair. Because circumstances change, he said simply. People change. Pressure happens. This way, no transaction is ever truly complete without your full informed consent. And the verification, I asked. He smiled faintly. That stays with you. Always. I had signed the papers that day without much thought beyond practicality. It was just another layer, another safeguard, something I hoped I would never need. Standing in that small apartment kitchen years later, I realized just how much that decision had mattered, because now, that safeguard was the only thing standing between what they believed was theirs and what still belonged to me. I finished my coffee and returned to the table, opened the box again, this time not to revisit what was inside, but to confirm what I already knew. The documents were intact. The recorder still held its evidence. The envelope still sealed the truth in legal form. Everything I needed was right there. All that remained was deciding how to use it. I didn't rush. That was the difference between me and them. They had acted quickly, eagerly, confident in their assumptions. I would act carefully, deliberately. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts. It didn't take long to find the number. Michael Carter, the name Harold had recommended all those years ago when he retired. Sharp mind, Harold had said, doesn't miss details, doesn't lose cases. I hesitated for only a second before pressing call. The line rang twice before a calm professional voice answered. Carter Law Offices, how can I help you? Yes, I said, steadying my voice. I'd like to schedule a consultation. My name is Christina Russell. The office was downtown. Modern, polished, everything in its place. Michael Carter himself was younger than I expected, mid-40s perhaps, but his eyes carried the kind of focus I recognized immediately. He listened without interrupting as I explained everything: the house, the sale, the transfer of funds, Daniel, Vanessa, the pressure, the timing, and finally, the box. I placed it on his desk, opened it, and let him see. For a long moment he said nothing, just read, examined, listened to the recording, reviewed the addendum. When he finally leaned back in his chair, his expression had changed from neutral to interested. Mrs. Russell, he said slowly, do they know about any of this? No, I replied. He nodded once. Good. There was no hesitation in his tone, no uncertainty. Because from what I'm seeing here, he continued tapping the document lightly. The transaction they completed is incomplete. I felt my chest tighten slightly. Not in fear, in confirmation. Incomplete, I asked. He met my eyes directly. Yes, he said. Legally, the sale lacks a required verification tied to the original deed. Without that, the transfer can be challenged. Challenged, the word echoed in my mind, and the funds, I asked. His expression hardened just slightly. If the sale is invalidated, he said, the financial distribution tied to that sale becomes very complicated for the receiving parties. Complicated. I understood what he meant. They wouldn't just lose the house. They could lose everything connected to it. Michael closed the folder gently. You have a strong position, he said. Stronger than they likely realize. I exhaled slowly. And my options. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied me, carefully, as if weighing something beyond the legal details. You can pursue this aggressively, he said finally. File immediately challenge the sale, reclaim full control. He paused. Or, I tilted my head slightly. Or you can take a more measured approach, he said. Use this leverage to negotiate, set terms, establish boundaries. Leverage. The word settled differently than the others, because that's what this was. Not just protection, not just defense. Leverage. The ability to decide how this story would end. I looked down at the small blue box, then back at him, and if I do nothing, I asked. He gave a slight knowing smile. Then they continue believing they've won, he said, until the consequences catch up. I left the office with the box in my hands and something else in my chest. Clarity. Not about what had happened, that part was already understood, but about what came next. Because for the first time since Daniel zipped up that suitcase, the direction wasn't theirs. It was mine. And somewhere in that new house they had chosen without me. They were still living in the comfort of certainty, still believing the past was settled, still unaware that the future had already shifted, all because of one thing they overlooked, one thing they didn't think to question, one small blue box, and the truth it carried. I didn't act immediately. That was the first decision I made after leaving Michael Carter's office. Not because I was unsure, but because timing matters. In numbers, in contracts, and especially in people. You don't apply pressure the moment you discover leverage. You wait. You let the other side settle into their illusion of control. You let them build confidence on a foundation you already know is unstable. And then you shift it. The days that followed were quiet, deliberately so. I moved through my small apartment with a calm I hadn't felt in weeks. I made simple meals, took slow walks in the late afternoon, watched the city from my window as if I were just another woman adjusting to a smaller life. But inside, I was preparing. Michael had sent me copies of everything we needed, draft notices, legal language precise enough to cut cleanly when the time came. He had also given me advice clear-measured and grounded in experience. Don't make it emotional, he had said. Make it undeniable. I understood that. Emotion clouds judgment, facts don't. Still, this wasn't just a legal matter. It was my life, my son, and that complicated everything. I thought about Daniel more than I wanted to admit. Not the man he had become in recent months, but the boy he had been. There's a particular memory that kept returning to me. He was 12, sitting at the kitchen table late at night, struggling with a math problem. I had been exhausted after a long shift, my head pounding my patience thin. But I sat with him anyway. You don't give up just because it's hard, I had told him. You figure it out. He had frowned at the paper, frustrated. What if I can't, he asked. I remember placing my hand over his. You can, I said. You just haven't yet. That was the kind of lesson I had tried to give him. Persistence, integrity, responsibility. And yet, somewhere along the way, something had changed. Or maybe something had been revealed. On the fourth day, Michael called. They've started moving funds, he said without preamble. I stood by the window watching a car pass slowly below. How much I asked. Not all of it, he replied, but enough to indicate they believe the transaction is secure. Of course they did. They're acting quickly, I said. Yes, he agreed, which means we shouldn't wait much longer. I closed my eyes briefly. This was the moment, the point where thought becomes action. Prepare the notice, I said. It's ready, he replied. All it needs is your approval. I hesitated for just a second. Not out of doubt, but out of acknowledgement, because once this moved forward, there would be no pretending things could return to what they were. Send it, I said. The notice wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. No raised voices, no accusations, just facts. Precise. Unavoidable. It was delivered electronically first, then physically the same afternoon. Michael had explained why. Speed matters, he said, but confirmation matters more. I imagined the moment it arrived, Daniel checking his phone, Vanessa reading the email, the shift in their expressions, the confusion, then the realization. I didn't have to be there to see it. I knew exactly how it would unfold. My phone rang that evening. I didn't need to check the screen. I knew who it was. I let it ring once, twice, 3 times. Then I answered. Hello, Mom. Daniel's voice came through, tight, strained. What is this? I leaned back in my chair. What are you referring to? I asked calmly. The notice, he said, the legal notice. It says the sale. He paused as if the words didn't quite make sense to him. It says the sale isn't valid. I let the silence stretch, not to punish him, but to make him sit with the reality of it. It's not, I said. What do you mean it's not? He demanded, his voice rising. We sold the house. The money's already been transferred. Yes, I replied. You did. Another pause, longer this time, and then quietly. Mom, what did you do? There it was. Not accusation, not yet, just confusion. Fear beginning to surface. I protected myself, I said. You? He stopped, exhaling sharply. Vanessa's talking to a lawyer right now. They're saying this doesn't make sense, that everything was signed. Everything you were given was signed, I corrected. That distinction mattered. It doesn't work like that, he said quickly, almost desperately. You can't just undo something like this. I closed my eyes for a moment. You should listen to your lawyer, I said. They'll explain it to you. There was a sound in the background, Vanessa's voice, sharp, urgent. Ask her about the clause, she said, loud enough for me to hear. The secondary verification. Of course she had found it, or at least part of it. Daniel's voice returned more controlled now. Mom, he said, what is she talking about? I opened my eyes, looked at the small blue box resting on the table. The part you didn't read, I said. There was a long silence, and in that silence, I could hear it. The shift. The moment the ground beneath them began to move. "You're saying," Daniel began slowly, "that the sale isn't complete." "I'm saying," I replied, "that it's not legally finalized without my full authorization. But you signed." "I signed what I was given." I interrupted gently. "That's not the same thing." Vanessa's voice cut in again, sharper this time. "This is manipulation," she said. "She's trying to reverse the deal." I almost smiled. "No, not reverse, correct." Daniel spoke again, his tone different now, less certain. "What do you want, Mom?" he asked. There it was. The question that matters. Not what happened, not why. What now? I stood up slowly, walking toward the window. "What I want," I said, "is for you to understand something." "And what's that actions have consequences?" Silence. Heavy. Unavoidable. You can't just take something, I continued, and decide it's yours because it's convenient. "We didn't take anything," Vanessa snapped in the background. I ignored her. "I gave you trust," I said. "You turned it into a transaction." Daniel didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice was quieter. "Mom, we were trying to help." I let out a slow breath. "I know that's what you told yourself," I said. Another pause. "And now?" he asked. I turned away from the window, looked at the room around me. Simple, temporary, but mine. "Now," I said, "we do things properly." "What does that mean?" "It means," I replied, "you come to the table." After I ended the call, I stood there for a long time, the phone still in my hand, the silence returning. But it wasn't the same silence as before. This one was different because now they knew. Not everything, not yet, but enough. Enough to feel the shift, enough to understand that what they believed was finished was far from over. I walked back to the table and placed my hand on the small blue box, the one thing they had overlooked, the one thing that changed everything. And now, the game had finally begun. The next morning, the calls didn't stop. Daniel called again, twice, then 3 times. I didn't answer, not immediately, because urgency has a purpose. And right now, that purpose belonged to me. I made my coffee slowly, watched the steam rise from the cup, let the quiet stretch just long enough to settle my thoughts before I finally picked up the phone and returned his call. He answered on the first ring. "Mom." His voice sounded different, less certain, less controlled. "What's happening?" he asked. I leaned back in my chair, calm, steady. "That depends," I said, "on how you choose to respond." There was a pause. Then I heard Vanessa in the background again, sharp, impatient. "Put it on speaker," she said. Daniel hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then I heard the faint click. "You're on speaker," he said. Of course I was. Vanessa didn't like conversations she couldn't control. "Christina." She said, her tone measured but tight. "We've reviewed the documents. This clause you're referring to, it's ambiguous." I almost smiled. "Is that what your lawyer said?" I asked. Another pause. "Yes," she replied. "Then I suggest you ask them to read it again," I said. Silence. Short, but heavier now, because confidence once shaken doesn't recover easily. Daniel spoke next. "Mom, can we just talk about this calmly?" he said. "There's no need to escalate things." Escalate. Interesting word. I agree, I said. "There's no need for that," Vanessa exhaled sharply. "Then what exactly are you doing?" she asked. Because from where I'm standing, this looks like an attempt to invalidate a legal transaction after the fact. I let her words sit, because that was how she saw it. A transaction, always a transaction. "What I'm doing," I said, "is making sure the process is completed correctly." "It was completed correctly," she insisted. "No," I replied calmly. "It wasn't. There was a shift on the other end of the line. I could hear it in the silence, in the way neither of them rushed to speak, because somewhere beneath the frustration, beneath the defensiveness, the doubt had taken root. Daniel broke the silence. "What happens if it's not valid?" he asked. The question hung there, careful, cautious. I chose my answer just as carefully. "That depends on how far things have gone," I said, "and how quickly they can be corrected." "Corrected," Vanessa repeated. "Yes." She let out a short, disbelieving laugh. You mean undone? I didn't respond to that because there's a difference between undoing something and revealing that it was never fully done to begin with. Look, Daniel said, his voice strained now we didn't know about any of this. If there's something missing, we can fix it. Fix it. I closed my eyes briefly. There it was again, the assumption that everything could be resolved quickly, cleanly, without consequence. You can't fix something you didn't take the time to understand, I said. That's not fair, Vanessa snapped. No, I replied quietly. What wasn't fair was assuming you could make decisions about my life without me. Another silence. Longer this time. And this one landed. Daniel spoke again, but softer. Mom, we didn't mean to hurt you. I let the words settle. Didn't mean to. Meaning doesn't erase impact. I know I said. And I did. At least I knew what he wanted to believe. But you did, I added. His breath caught slightly. I could hear it. Because this was the part he hadn't allowed himself to feel yet. Not fully. What do you want us to do? He asked. There it was again. The question returning. Not defensive now. Not argumentative. Just uncertain. I stood up and walked toward the window, looking out at the quiet street below. I want you to come meet me, I said. Meet you, he repeated. Yes, Vanessa cut in immediately. That's not necessary. We can handle this through lawyers. Of course she said that. Distance is easier. Control is easier when emotions aren't involved. No, I said firmly, this is necessary. Why she demanded. I turned away from the window. Because this part mattered. Because this isn't just about paperwork, I said. It's about understanding what you did. Silence. Then Daniel, where I gave him the address of Michael's office. Tomorrow, I added. 10 a.m. Vanessa exhaled sharply. We're not agreeing to anything yet, she said. You don't have to, I replied. Just be there. After the call ended, I set the phone down slowly. My hands were steady, my breathing even, but inside. Something had shifted again, because this was no longer just about leverage or documents or clauses. It was about confrontation, the kind that forces truth into the open, and truth has weight. The rest of the day passed quietly, but my mind didn't. It moved through possibilities, through outcomes, through choices, because what happened next would define everything. Not just the legal result, but what remained of us as a family, if anything remained at all. The next morning, I arrived early. Michael was already there reviewing documents at his desk. They'll come, he said without looking up. Yes, I replied, they will, because they had to. Curiosity alone would bring them, but something else would too. Fear. At exactly 10 o'clock, the door opened. Daniel walked in first. Vanessa right behind him. They looked different. Not composed, not confident, alert, careful, aware. Their eyes found me immediately, and for a moment, no one spoke. Then Daniel stepped forward. Mom, just that, one word. But it carried something new, not certainty, not control, something closer to hesitation. Vanessa stayed slightly behind him, her posture straight, her expression guarded. Let's sit, Michael said, gesturing toward the table. We did, the four of us, across from each other. Not as family, not anymore, as parties, Michael began. Thank you for coming, he said calmly. I think it's important we address this situation clearly. Vanessa leaned forward slightly. We agree, she said. Which is why we've also consulted counsel. Of course they had, Michael nodded. Then you understand the issue, he said. Daniel glanced at Vanessa before answering. We understand there's a clause, he said, but we don't believe it invalidates the entire transaction. Michael folded his hands. That's where we disagree, he said. And just like that, the room shifted. Because this wasn't a conversation anymore. It was a reality check. One they hadn't been prepared for. I watched them carefully. Not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with clarity. Because this was the moment the illusion began to break, not all at once, but enough. Enough for them to feel it. enough for them to understand that what they thought they controlled was never fully theirs. And now, they were sitting across from the one person they had underestimated, the one person they had overlooked, the one person who still held everything together. Me. And this time, they couldn't look away. For a moment, no one spoke. The air in Michael's conference room felt different from the spaces Daniel and Vanessa were used to controlling. It wasn't a kitchen they could rearrange or a conversation they could redirect. It was neutral ground, structured, deliberate, and bound by facts. And facts don't bend easily. Michael opened the folder in front of him. "Let's begin with clarity," he said calmly. "The sale of the Russell property proceeded without the required secondary verification tied to the original deed. That verification is legally binding. Without it, the transaction is incomplete." Vanessa leaned forward, her posture tightening. "We've already reviewed that clause," she said. "It's vague. It doesn't explicitly state that the sale is void without it." Michael didn't react. "That's one interpretation," he replied. "It's not the one that will hold in court." Silence followed. Heavy. Daniel shifted in his seat. "So what are you saying?" he asked. "That the house isn't sold?" Michael met his eyes. "I'm saying," he answered, "that the sale can be legally challenged and potentially invalidated." Potentially. That word mattered. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was enough. Vanessa's jaw tightened. "And the money?" she asked. Michael didn't hesitate. "If the transaction is deemed invalid," he said, "any financial distribution tied to that transaction becomes subject to reversal." Reversal. The word landed like a weight on the table between them. I watched their reactions carefully. Daniel's eyes flickered, processing, calculating. Vanessa's expression hardened, resisting, analyzing. Two very different responses. Two very different truths. "This is unbelievable," Vanessa said, finally, her voice controlled but sharp. "We acted in good faith. Everything was signed. Everything was processed." Michael nodded slightly. "I don't doubt that you believe the process was complete," he said. "But belief doesn't override legal requirements." Vanessa let out a short breath, almost a laugh. "So what you're saying, she can just undo everything just like that?" I spoke then, for the first time since we sat down. "No," I said quietly. They both turned to look at me. "I'm saying," I continued, "that everything wasn't done properly to begin with." Daniel's gaze lingered on me. There was something different in it now. Not just confusion, not just frustration, something closer to realization. "Mom," he said slowly, "why didn't you tell us about this?" The question hung in the air, simple, direct, and layered with something deeper. I held his gaze. "Because you didn't ask," I said, silence. That answer landed harder than anything Michael had said, because it wasn't legal, it was personal. Vanessa shook her head. "That's not fair," she said. "You knew we were handling everything. You should have disclosed something like that." I turned to her. "Should I have?" I asked calmly. She hesitated, just for a second. But it was enough. "Transparency goes both ways," I added, her lips pressed into a thin line, because she knew. They both did. This wasn't just about a clause. It was about everything that led up to it. Daniel leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered. "We weren't trying to take anything from you." I watched him. Really watched. Because this was the part that mattered. Not the argument, the understanding. "You didn't think you were," I said. His eyes lifted to meet mine. "But you were making decisions about my life," I continued. "My home, my future, without including me. That's not—" He started, then stopped, because he couldn't finish the sentence. "Not honestly." Vanessa stepped in again. "We were trying to optimize the situation," she said. "Financially, it made sense. You had more than you needed, and you decided what I needed," I interrupted gently. Her words cut off. The room fell quiet again. Because there it was, the truth. Not complicated, not hidden, just undeniable. Michael cleared his throat softly. "Let's bring this back to the matter at hand," he said. "Mrs. Russell has the legal right to challenge the transaction. The question is how she chooses to proceed." All eyes turned to me. Daniel's, Vanessa's. Even Michael's, though his was more measured. This was the moment, the pivot, not just for the case, but for everything. "What are you going to do?" Daniel asked. His voice was quieter now, less defensive, more uncertain. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I reached into my bag and slowly, deliberately, I took out the small blue box. Vanessa's eyes narrowed slightly. "What is that?" she asked. I didn't respond. I placed the box on the table, opened it, and turned it toward them. The documents, the recorder, the envelope, everything they had overlooked, everything that had shifted the balance. Daniel leaned forward slightly. Vanessa didn't move, but I could see it. The recognition, the tension, the calculation. I picked up the recorder, pressed play. The room filled with sound. "We can't wait too long," Vanessa's voice. Clear, unfiltered, unmasked. Daniel froze. Vanessa went completely still. Once it's sold, everything else falls into place. I let the recording continue just long enough. Then I turned it off. Silence crashed back into the room. Heavy, unavoidable. Daniel's face had changed. Not just confusion now, not just uncertainty. Something deeper, something breaking. "Vanessa?" he said slowly, his voice strained. "What is that?" She didn't answer immediately, because she couldn't, because there was nothing to say that would undo what had just been heard. "That," I said calmly, "is the part you weren't supposed to hear." Vanessa's eyes snapped to mine. "You recorded us," she said, her voice sharp. "I protected myself," I replied. Michael remained silent, observing, letting the moment unfold, because this wasn't about him anymore. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his hand covering his mouth. This isn't," he started, then stopped. He looked at Vanessa, waiting, searching for an explanation, for something that would make it different, better, less real. Vanessa straightened slightly. "It's being taken out of context," she said quickly. "You don't understand the situation." But Daniel didn't look convinced, because context doesn't erase intent, not when it's this clear. "Do I?" he asked quietly. That question wasn't for me, it was for her. And for the first time, she didn't have an immediate answer. I watched them, not with satisfaction, not with anger, but with a kind of quiet certainty, because this was the moment everything came into focus. Not just legally, but emotionally. Truth has a way of doing that, of cutting through everything else, of leaving only what's real, and what was real was sitting right in front of us. "Now," I said gently, "we can talk about what happens next." No one interrupted, no one argued, because for the first time since this began, they weren't in control, and they knew it. For a long moment, no one spoke. The recording had done what no argument ever could. It had stripped everything down to truth, not interpretation, not intention, not explanation, just truth. Daniel sat frozen, his hand still covering part of his mouth, his eyes fixed somewhere between the recorder and Vanessa. He wasn't looking at me anymore. He wasn't even fully present in the room. He was processing, rebuilding something in his mind that had just been broken. Vanessa, on the other hand, recovered first. She always did. "That doesn't prove anything," she said, her voice steady again, though a fraction tighter than before. "A conversation doesn't invalidate a transaction." Michael finally leaned forward. "No," he said calmly, "but it does establish intent." Vanessa turned to him sharply. Intent of what she asked. Intent to influence a decision without full disclosure, he replied, which, when combined with the missing legal verification, complicates your position significantly. Complicates. Again, that careful language, measured, precise. But the meaning underneath it was anything but soft. Vanessa leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "We didn't do anything illegal," she said. "I spoke before Michael could." "No," I said quietly. "You didn't." Both of them looked at me. "Not illegal," I continued. "Just wrong." That word hung in the air longer than any legal term could, because legality and morality don't always align, but when they collide, the impact is heavier. Daniel lowered his hand slowly. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked again. His voice had changed, not defensive, not even confused anymore, just raw. I met his eyes. I wanted to see how far you would go, I said. The honesty of it landed harder than anything else I had said. His expression tightened. You think I would have just taken everything he asked? I didn't answer immediately, because the answer wasn't simple. I think I said carefully that you didn't stop to ask yourself that question. Silence. Daniel looked down at the table, and for the first time since this began, he didn't argue. Vanessa exhaled sharply. This is turning into something emotional when it should be about facts, she said. The fact is, the house was sold. The money is in motion. We've already made commitments based on that. Of course they had. That was the risk of moving too fast, of assuming control without securing it. Michael nodded slightly. And those commitments, he said, are exactly why this needs to be resolved properly. Properly, Vanessa repeated. What does that even mean at this point? It was Daniel who answered. We fix it, he said quietly. Vanessa turned to him, surprised. What we fix it, he repeated louder this time. Whatever's wrong, we fix it. And how exactly do you propose we do that? She asked, her tone sharpening again. Daniel looked at me. Not at Michael, not at the documents, at me. What do you want, Mom? He asked. The question came back. But this time, it was different. Because now it wasn't about control. It was about consequence. And maybe something else. Regret. I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands in my lap. This was the moment I had thought about, planned for, not in detail, but in principle. Because power isn't just about having leverage, it's about how you choose to use it. I could invalidate the sale, I said calmly. Vanessa's eyes flickered. Daniel didn't react immediately. I could push this through legally, I continued. Reclaim the property, reverse the transaction, force everything back to where it started. Michael didn't interrupt. He didn't need to, because he knew it was true. And you won't? Daniel asked. I looked at him, really looked, at the man sitting across from me, and the boy I still remembered. I didn't say that I replied. The tension in the room tightened. Vanessa leaned forward again. Then what are you saying? She asked. I let the silence stretch, because this part mattered. I'm saying I said slowly that I'm choosing not to. For a moment, no one understood. Then Daniel blinked. You're not, he asked. Vanessa frowned. That doesn't make sense, she said. If you have the leverage, why wouldn't you use it? I met her gaze, because this was never about the house, I said. She stared at me, uncomprehending. Of course she didn't understand, because for her, it had always been about the house, the value, the transaction, the outcome. But for me, it was about something else entirely. It was about trust, I said. Daniel's shoulders dropped slightly. It was about respect, I continued, about being treated like I mattered, not just like something to be managed. Vanessa looked away. Daniel didn't. I see that now, he said quietly, and for the first time, I believed him. Not completely, not fully, but enough. So what happens next, he asked. I took a slow breath. The sale stays, I said. Vanessa's head snapped back toward me. What the transaction continues, I clarified. No legal challenge, no reversal. Michael nodded slightly, confirming the possibility. Vanessa leaned back, relief flashing across her face before she could hide it. That's reasonable, she said quickly, but I wasn't finished. However, I added. And just like that, the relief vanished. Daniel leaned forward slightly. However, what he asked. I reached into the box again, pulled out the documents, placed them on the table. However, I said the financial control changes. Vanessa's expression hardened, how she demanded. I met her gaze directly. Because the proceeds came from my asset, I said, and that asset was not transferred properly without my full authorization. Michael spoke then. Mrs. Russell retains legal leverage over the distribution, he said, which means any agreements moving forward can be adjusted. Adjusted. Vanessa shook her head. No, she said. That's not how this works. Yes, Michael replied calmly. It is. Daniel looked between us, trying to understand, trying to catch up. "What does that mean?" he asked. I answered him. "It means I said that I decide what happens next." Silence. Again. But this one was different, because now it wasn't about confusion. It was about acceptance. "I'm not taking everything back," I said. Vanessa didn't respond. Daniel listened. "I'm not undoing the sale," I continued. "I'm not destroying what you've already set in motion." I paused. "But I am setting boundaries." Daniel nodded slowly. "What kind of boundaries?" he asked. I held his gaze. "The kind that should have been there from the beginning," I said. And in that moment, something shifted again. Not in the room, but in him. Because for the first time since this began, he wasn't just reacting. He was listening, really listening. And that mattered more than anything else. The room didn't move. No one shifted in their seat. No one reached for their phone. Even Vanessa, who had spent every moment trying to stay one step ahead, remained still. Because now the conversation had changed. It wasn't about whether I could act. It was about how I would. And that made all the difference. "I'm not interested in punishment," I said calmly. Vanessa's eyes flickered, searching my face for something: weakness, hesitation, anything she could use. She wouldn't find it. "But I am interested in accountability," I continued. Daniel nodded slowly, his expression more grounded than I had seen in a long time. "What do you need from me?" he asked. "Not from us, from me." That shift mattered. I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands on the table. "I need you to understand what you did," I said. "Not just legally, not just financially." He swallowed. "I'm trying to," he said. "I believed that too. Trying, late, but real." Vanessa, however, wasn't ready to let go. "This still doesn't make sense," she said. "If the sale stands, then the funds are already allocated. There are commitments, plans." "Your plans," I interrupted gently. She stopped. Because that was the truth. They weren't my plans. They never had been. "This is exactly the problem," I said. "Everything was decided without me. Everything assumed." Daniel looked down at the table. Vanessa looked away. Because there was no argument for that. "So here's what happens," I said. And this time, no one interrupted. "The proceeds from the sale will be restructured," I continued. "A portion will be set aside under my control, not as a favor, not as a gift." I paused, as a correction. Michael nodded slightly, already understanding where this was going. Vanessa's lips pressed together, and the rest, she asked, her voice tighter now. "The rest," I said, "can be used, however you choose." Daniel looked up, surprised. "You're still letting us keep part of it?" he asked. I met his eyes. "I'm not here to take your life apart," I said. "I'm here to make sure mine isn't erased." That landed deep, because for the first time, he understood the difference. Vanessa leaned forward again, but this time there was less confidence in her posture. "And what about the house we bought?" she asked. "The new one," I tilted my head slightly. "What about it?" "It was purchased with those funds," she said. "If you're restructuring, I'm not undoing your purchase," I replied. Her shoulders dropped just slightly, but I added, and again the tension returned. "You will be responsible for maintaining it," I said, independently. Daniel frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" "It means," I said, "that whatever portion of the funds you retain, you manage, you maintain, you take responsibility for." Vanessa opened her mouth, then closed it again, because she understood. No more shared control, no more quiet assumptions, no more hidden leverage. "And you?" Daniel asked. I leaned back in my chair. "I will find my own place," I said. That part had never been in question. Not anymore. "You're not coming back?" he asked. There it was. The question beneath everything else. I held his gaze. "No," I said gently. Not out of anger, not out of punishment, but out of clarity. Because some doors, once closed, should stay that way. The silence that followed wasn't heavy this time. It was settling. Like dust after something has been shaken. Vanessa looked down at the table, her fingers tracing the edge of the documents in front of her. She wasn't arguing anymore. Not because she agreed, but because she understood the position she was in. And Daniel was somewhere else entirely. Not in the room, not fully. He was looking inward, and that was something I hadn't seen in a long time. "I messed up," he said finally. The words were quiet, but they carried weight, real weight. Vanessa didn't respond. Michael didn't either, because this part didn't belong to them. "I thought I was doing the right thing," Daniel continued. "I thought I was helping, that I was being smart about it." I nodded slowly. "I know," I said. "And I didn't stop," he added. "I didn't question anything. I just went along with it. That was the truth. Not manipulation, not control, but passivity. And sometimes, that's just as damaging." "I can't change what I did," he said. "No," I replied, "but I can change what I do next." That was the moment. Not the documents, not the clause, not the money, that sentence, because that's where real change begins. Vanessa finally spoke again, but her voice was different now. Quieter, less certain. "So what happens to us?" she asked. I looked at her, really looked. For the first time, I didn't see just control or calculation. I saw something else. Fear, not of me, but of losing what she had built. "That's not my decision," I said. She blinked. "What?" "That's between you and Daniel," I clarified, because it was, always had been. I wasn't going to step into that space, not anymore. Daniel turned toward her slowly. Their eyes met. And in that moment, everything that had been hidden between them surfaced, not in words, but in silence. And sometimes, that says more than anything else. Michael cleared his throat gently. "I'll have the revised agreements drafted," he said. "We can formalize everything within the week." Vanessa nodded. Daniel didn't. He was still looking at me. "Mom," he said quietly. I met his eyes. "I'm sorry." The words were simple, unpolished, unprepared, and that's why they mattered, because for the first time, they weren't part of a plan. They were real. I held his gaze for a moment, then nodded. "I know," I said. And I did. When the meeting ended, we stood. Not as adversaries, not exactly as family, but as something in between. Something unfinished. Vanessa gathered her things first, her movements slower than before. Daniel lingered. "Will I see you again?" he asked. I thought about that. Not quickly, not lightly. "Yes," I said, "but not the way it used to be." He nodded, accepting it, understanding even if it hurt. I picked up the small blue box, closed it, and for the first time since all of this began, it felt lighter. Not because it had lost its importance, but because it had served its purpose. It had protected me, given me control, given me the space to choose, and now the choice had been made. As I walked out of the office, the sunlight hit my face warm and steady, not harsh, not overwhelming, just present, like something new. Behind me, the past was still settling, still shifting, but ahead was something else, something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Not perfect, not complete, but real. And that was enough, for now. The first place I chose for myself wasn't impressive. It wasn't modern like the house Vanessa had picked, and it certainly wasn't large like the one I had spent most of my life building. It was smaller, quieter, a single-story home at the edge of a modest neighborhood just outside the city. But it had something the others didn't. It felt like mine. The day I got the keys, I stood at the front door for a long moment before stepping inside. Not because I was overwhelmed, but because I was aware of the difference between being placed somewhere and choosing where you stand. I walked in slowly, my footsteps echoing lightly against the hardwood floors. The rooms were empty but not cold. The sunlight came in through wide windows, soft and steady, touching every corner without effort. There were no memories here yet, no history, no weight. And that was exactly what I needed. A place where nothing had been taken from me. A place where everything that came next would be mine to build. The process of settling in took time. Not because it was difficult, but because I allowed it to be slow, intentional. Each piece of furniture I brought in had a purpose. Each photograph I placed on the walls was chosen not out of obligation, but out of meaning. I found the old picture of Daniel at 8 years old, the one Vanessa had boxed away. I placed it on a small shelf in the living room, not in the center, not as a statement, but not hidden either, because that's what he was now, not the center of my world anymore, but still part of it. Weeks passed quietly, without disruption. The legal agreements were finalized just as Michael had promised. The funds were restructured. Boundaries were set not just on paper, but in reality. Daniel and Vanessa kept the house they had chosen. They kept their portion of the money, and they kept the responsibility that came with both. I kept what mattered to me: control, dignity, and the understanding that I would never again hand those things over without question. Daniel called 2 weeks after everything was settled. I let it ring once before answering. "Hi," he said, "just that. No pressure, no expectation." "Hi," I replied. There was a pause. Not awkward. Just careful. "I wanted to see how you're doing," he said. I glanced around my living room, the soft light, the quiet space, the life I had started to shape again. "I'm doing well," I said. And I meant it. "I'm glad," he replied. Another pause. Then more quietly, "I've been thinking a lot. I figured you might," I said gently. He let out a small breath. "I should have listened," he said. "Not just to you, but to myself. That surprised me. Not the apology, but the awareness behind it." "What do you mean?" I asked. "I knew something didn't feel right," he admitted, "the way things were moving, the decisions. But I told myself it was fine, that it made sense, that it was normal. I understood that word more than he realized. Sometimes I said we convince ourselves something is normal, because it's easier than questioning it. He was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said, "that's exactly what I did. He didn't ask to come over. He didn't ask for anything." And that mattered, because for the first time in a long time, he wasn't trying to take space. He was respecting it. "I'd like to see you," he said eventually, "when you're ready. Not when it's convenient. Not when it works for him. When you're ready." I smiled slightly. "That would be nice," I said. Vanessa didn't call. Not at first, but I heard about her. Not directly. Through Daniel. "She's adjusting," he said during one of our later conversations. I didn't ask for details. I didn't need to. Because some lessons don't come from words. They come from consequences, and consequences have a way of settling in over time. The first time Daniel came to my new house, he stood at the doorway just like I had, looking in, taking it in. "It's peaceful," he said. I nodded. "Yes," I replied. He stepped inside slowly, his eyes moving from one space to another, noticing the small details, the framed photo, the simple furniture, the absence of anything unnecessary. "You did this yourself," he said. "I did," I replied. He nodded again, and I could see it. The difference. Not just in how he looked at the house, but in how he looked at me. Not as someone to manage, not as someone to guide, but as someone to respect. We sat together in the living room that afternoon, not talking about the past, not immediately, just sitting, letting the silence exist without needing to fill it. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like something real, not perfect, not complete, but honest. "I don't expect things to go back to the way they were," he said eventually. I looked at him. "No," I replied. "They won't." He nodded. "I don't want that either," he added. That surprised me again. "Why not?" I asked. He hesitated. "Because I didn't deserve it," he said. There it was. Not guilt, not shame, understanding. And that was something new. "I want to do better," he said. I studied his face, the lines I hadn't noticed before, the weight he carried now, not from me, from himself. "Then do it," I said, simple, clear. Because change isn't proven in words, it's proven in time. As he left that day, he paused at the door. "Mom," he said. I turned. "Thank you," he added. "For what?" He hesitated. Then, "For not taking everything away." I smiled softly. "That wasn't the lesson I said." He frowned slightly. I looked past him toward the quiet street, the life moving forward in its own steady rhythm. The lesson I said was that not everything you think you have belongs to you. He stood there for a moment, then nodded. And this time, he understood. That night, I sat by the window, the small blue box resting on the table beside me. I opened it one last time, not to check, not to prepare, just to acknowledge what it had been, what it had done, and what it no longer needed to be, because the power it held was no longer in the documents or the recordings. It was in the choices I had made and the life I had rebuilt. I closed the box gently, and for the first time, I didn't feel the need to keep it close, because everything it had protected was already safe. Sometimes the people we trust the most don't betray us all at once. It happens slowly, in small decisions, in quiet assumptions, in moments where they choose convenience over care, and we choose silence over confrontation. Christina's story isn't just about a house. It's about boundaries. It's about understanding that love does not mean surrendering control of your life. It's about knowing that kindness without limits can become permission for others to take more than they should. But most importantly, it's about preparation, because strength isn't just emotional, it's practical. Knowing your rights, protecting what you've built, thinking ahead even when it feels unnecessary. That's not distrust, that's wisdom. And when the moment comes when life tests you in ways you never expected, it's that preparation that gives you the power to choose. Not to destroy, not to take revenge, but to restore balance, to stand your ground and to walk away with dignity. So I want to ask you, if you were in Christina's position, would you have done the same? Or would you have chosen differently? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd really like to hear your perspective. And if this story made you feel something, reminded you of someone, or taught you something valuable, don't forget to like and subscribe, because sometimes the stories we hear are the ones we need the most.